If you grew up in the late 80s and early 90s, you didn't just watch movies. You memorized faces. You framed them. You locked them in a very specific corner of your mind where time wasn't allowed to exist. There was a specific kind of magic back then, an analog fame that simply doesn't exist in our era of viral outrage and 24-hour confessionals. In that world, two faces became more than just famous. They became personal. On one side, you had Phoebe Cates, the sun-drenched, effortless allure of 1982. On the other, Bridget Fonda, the cool, modern, intellectual heartbeat of 1992. Both were born into the purple of Hollywood royalty. Both had the industry in their DNA. Both were handed the keys to the kingdom. And then, they did the one thing the fame machine never permits. They chose to be forgotten. But here is the smoking gun that Hollywood refuses to talk about. While they both walked through the same exit door, the fate waiting on the other side had two very different prices for them to pay. Today, we go beyond the posters on the bedroom wall. We're revealing the secret pact Phoebe Cates made with her husband that allowed her to keep her soul, and the devastating Malibu crash that shattered Bridget Fonda's dynasty, turning her from a muse into a ghost. Why is one of these women celebrated as a success while the other is pitied as a tragedy? When they both made the exact same choice to prioritize their families, why was the public's reaction so cruel? This is the heartbreaking reality of the vanished it girls. Because in a town built on illusions, the only thing more dangerous than failing is being real. To understand why their disappearance felt like a betrayal, we have to return to the atmosphere of that era. Close your eyes and think back to the early 80 seconds. Think about the magazines on the rack at the local pharmacy. Fame wasn't something you scrolled past on a phone. It was something you worshipped on a 20-foot screen in a darkened theater. There was a distance to it, a mystery. And in that distance, the audience did something dangerous. We projected our own lives onto them. According to accounts from the time, Phoebe Cates represented a version of Hollywood that didn't shout. It listened. In Fast Times at Ridgemont High, she wasn't just performing a scene, she was creating a cultural milestone that would haunt the collective memory of a generation for 40 years. She smiled like someone who didn't need to prove anything. She was the embodiment of stability in an industry addicted to excess. Then, a decade later, the energy shifted. The neon of the 80 seconds faded into the grit of the 90 seconds, and Bridget Fonda arrived. She was different, more self-possessed, more intelligent. When the camera found her in Single White Female, or Point of No Return, it didn't just see a beautiful woman. It saw a woman who was always one step ahead of the room. What united them wasn't their style but their restraint. They didn't chase controversy. They didn't oversell emotion. They allowed us space to dream. And when an actress gives you space, your imagination fills it in. That's why it felt personal. They weren't just stars. They were anchors for our own nostalgia. But being an anchor in Hollywood comes with a terrifying, unspoken condition. You are required to stay frozen in the amber of our memories, forever. They didn't just walk into the industry. They were born into the machinery of performance. For both women, fame wasn't a mystery or a dream, it was a known quantity. A tool. Something that could be used or refused. Bridget Fonda was the princess of a dynasty that functioned like American royalty. Her grandfather was Henry Fonda, the literal conscience of the nation. Her father was Peter, the rebel on a motorcycle. Her aunt was Jane, the icon of power. To be a Fonda was to have a seat at the high table, but it was also to have a target on your back. Bridget once admitted that she spent her entire career feeling like she had to apologize for her last name. Every role wasn't just a job, it was a comparison to a legend. According to those who worked with her, she understood early on that success would never fully belong to her. It would always be measured against the ghosts of her ancestors. Phoebe Cates grew up with a similar, quiet awareness. Her father, Joseph Cates, was a pioneer who practically invented the television special. Scripts were on the coffee table. Rehearsals ran late. For Phoebe, the spotlight wasn't salvation, it was the family business. This independence is subtle, but it's dangerous to the Hollywood system. The industry functions best when stars believe they need the applause to survive. But these women carried the rare knowledge that life existed beyond the lens. They worked consistently, but never desperately. They weren't racing against time like their peers. They were waiting for the right moment to leave. Because for them, the applause sounded different. They had heard it echo and fade long before they ever stepped on a stage. Phoebe Cates was 31 years old. Think about that for a moment. At 31, she was at the absolute zenith of her beauty and her bankability. The world was demanding more. But Phoebe had already seen enough. She had married Kevin Kline 5 years earlier, and together, they made a secret pact that would baffle the LA elite. They decided they would raise their children in New York, not Los Angeles. More importantly, they agreed they would never both work at the same time. Phoebe looked at the red carpets, the paparazzi, and the endless demand for more, and she chose the mundane. She chose the nursery. She chose the kitchen. She eventually opened a boutique called Blue Tree on the Upper East Side, where she could be a person instead of a projection. For our audience watching today, you know that the great vanishing of Phoebe Cates was a victory. She walked away from the pool at Ridgemont High and never looked back. But there is a reason the public allowed her to leave with her dignity. Because she stayed recognizable. Appearing occasionally at her husband's side, looking elegant, polished, and crucially, preserved, she honored the unspoken contract. She didn't challenge the image we held of her. She remained safely inside the frame. We saw her as the star who chose love. We allowed her to win because she didn't force us to update our memories. But the fate had a much darker, much more violent plan for the other woman. February 2003. The Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. A heavy rain is turning the asphalt into a death trap. This is the smoking gun moment for Bridget Fonda. She was 39. She was conquering the decade. She was the muse for Tarantino and Coppola. But that night, her silver Jaguar didn't just skid. It flew. It rolled down an embankment and crushed itself against the earth. Bridget survived, but she was broken. She suffered a fractured vertebra in her back. While the world was waiting for her next comeback movie, Bridget was lying in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, realizing she had been given a second life. She looked at the twisted metal of her car and saw the twisted reality of her career. She realized she didn't want to be the Fonda anymore. She didn't want to be the 90 Seconds girl. She wanted to be a civilian. She married composer Danny Elfman shortly after, had a son, and pulled the curtain shut. But unlike Phoebe, Bridget didn't just retire. She vanished into a total, absolute silence that would last for nearly 20 years. No interviews, no red carpets, no curated glimpses. She denied the public the process of watching her age. She broke the spell, and when she finally re-emerged decades later, not as an icon, but as a regular person, the reaction from the public wasn't relief. It was a cold, calculated disappointment. To understand the cruelty of the public eye, we have to look at the photos that shook the internet in 2022. We live in a world that demands its icons stay frozen in time. Phoebe Cates has managed to do the impossible. When she appears today, the headlines scream that she is ageless. She has kept the illusion alive for us. And because she kept the illusion, we give her our respect. But then, there is Bridget. After 12 years of total silence, a paparazzi photographer caught her at an airport. The photos were harsh, unedited. They showed a woman who had let her hair go gray, a woman who was carrying the natural weight of a life lived away from trainers, stylists, and plastic surgeons. The internet didn't just notice, it attacked. The headlines called it a shocking transformation. They used words like unrecognizable. But why were we so angry? We weren't angry at Bridget. We were angry because she reminded us that 30 years have passed for us too. She broke the nostalgia contract. By choosing to age naturally, by choosing to look like a civilian, she forced us to look into our own mirrors and see the same gray hair, the same lines, the same passage of time. Hollywood can forgive a star for addiction, for scandals, or for crimes. but it can never forgive a woman for being human. In April of 2023, a reporter finally cornered Bridget at an airport. They wanted a deep dive. They wanted her to say she missed the glory, the lights, the importance of being a Fonda. But Bridget gave an answer more profound than any script she ever performed. She simply said, "No, it's too nice being a civilian." Let that word sink in. Civilian. To Bridget Fonda, Hollywood wasn't a career, it was a war. It was a service she had been drafted into the day she was born. For 3 generations, the Fondas had fought for the light. They had sacrificed their marriages, their privacy, and their peace to the screen. Henry gave his dignity, Peter gave his rebellion. Jane gave her soul. Bridget? Bridget decided she was the only one with the courage to desert. By becoming a civilian, she wasn't just retiring, she was breaking a cycle of generational trauma. She was protecting her son from the flashbulb circus that had haunted her family for nearly a century. Those paparazzi photos that the world called tragic? To Bridget, they were the photos of a woman who had finally won her freedom. She wasn't letting herself go. She was letting us go. There is an irony Hollywood never quite resolves. The very thing that made these women so compelling on screen, the sense that they were grounded, self-contained, and unafraid, was the same thing that made them capable of leaving. They weren't running from failure. They were walking away from success. And that is what the public finds unforgivable. We can forgive a star who collapses under pressure. Collapse confirms the myth that fame is irresistible. But someone who steps away calmly, deliberately, and without regret? That kind of choice challenges the fantasy itself. It suggests that the spotlight isn't the prize everyone was told it was. Phoebe Cates remained a memory. Protected by distance and the absence of contradiction, she allowed the audience to keep their version of her undisturbed. Bridget Fonda shattered the fantasy by appearing as a real person who had moved on without asking permission. The difference in how we treat them proves that our love for these women is often transactional. We extend our adoration as long as the image stays intact. The moment reality intrudes, the tone changes. The public eye doesn't always punish excess. Sometimes it punishes independence. It rewards those who remain safely symbolic and resists those who insist on being fully human. There is a word Hollywood avoids when it tells stories like these. Freedom. Freedom is dangerous because it doesn't photograph well. You can't package it as a comeback. You can't sell it as a cautionary tale. It simply exists. Quietly. According to observers of celebrity psychology, the hardest part of leaving fame isn't losing the attention, it's surrendering the version of yourself that others refuse to release. The version that never gets tired, never gets older, never asks for anything back. To walk away from that version requires a kind of internal violence. You have to kill the star before it consumes the person. Phoebe used a pact with her husband to create a bubble of safety. Bridget used a crash to build a wall of silence. Both women treated fame as a phase, not a destiny. Something they experienced, not something they owed their lives to. Their refusal feels threatening because it removes the audience from the center of the story. If a star can live fully without us, what role did we really play? They preserve the parts of themselves that fame slowly erodes: privacy, autonomy, and the right to change. By killing the star they were expected to remain, both women saved the lives they actually wanted to live. And that may be the bravest ending Hollywood never learned how to tell. As we sit here today, in a world that is louder, faster, and more demanding than the one we grew up in, the stories of Bridget Fonda and Phoebe Cates offer us something rare. They offer us a mirror. To our audience, the generation who lived through the neon of the 80 seconds and the grit of the 90 seconds, we are all civilians now. We have all felt the cruelty of time. We have all looked in the mirror and wondered exactly where the decades went. The fate of these two women isn't a tragedy, it's a revelation. We spent decades worshiping them because they were perfect. We put them on a pedestal because they represented a dream of eternal youth. But the real smoking gun of their lives is that the dream was a cage. Bridget Fonda's gray hair, her simple clothes, her quiet walk through an airport parking lot, That isn't a fall from grace. It's a graduation. She is showing us that there is life after the lens. She is showing us that legacy is something you leave behind so that you can finally start living. Phoebe Cates proved that you can keep the beauty and still walk away. Bridget Fonda proved that you can lose the beauty and find something even better. Yourself. In a town that wrings out every drop of blood from its icons, these two women are the ones who got away. They are the survivors. But their departure leaves us with one final haunting question. As we look back at the posters on our walls and the movies that defined our youth, we have to wonder, did we ever really love them? Or did we only love the fact that they never changed so that we didn't have to feel like we were getting older too? If you remember the magic of that era, if you remember the first time you saw Phoebe's smile or Bridget's gaze, tell us your favorite memory in the comments below. Let's remember them not as the icons they were forced to be, but as the women they were brave enough to become. Because sometimes, the greatest act of courage isn't staying in the spotlight, it's having the strength to turn it off. Thank you for watching. If you believe in the power of these stories, subscribe to join us as we uncover the hidden fates and forgotten tragedies of the stars who defined our lives. The story doesn't end here. It's just beginning to be understood.